Today we're exploring some big questions about the future of planning and the evolving role of planners in a rapidly changing world. This is all with our guest, Alice Charles.
When I meet with planners in the Nordics, they focus most of their time on forward planning, on placemaking, on bringing forward regeneration systems. And particularly with AI, will we need so many people focused on development control in the future?
Alice is a Chartered Town Planner and registered member of the Irish Planning Institute, and she is the Director for Cities, Planning and Design at Arup. She has advised governments, international organisations and city leaders in Ireland and across the world on how to create more resilient, inclusive and livable urban environments. She has also had a fascinating professional journey, which gives insights into the major global forces that are reshaping how our cities grow, evolve and function. Alice, look, it's great to have you with us, and I'm really looking forward to digging into your perspective on cities, planning, design, international trends, national trends, and everything else in the next while. But I do want to start by asking about your career. What drew you to study planning in the first place? And then really, where has that journey taken you up to today?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me, Sean. So I suppose what got me into planning in the first place was actually I have a brother with cerebral palsy, and I was growing up in Fermanagh in Northern Ireland, and one of the things I noticed was every single time we tried to do anything in the built environment, how difficult it was for him, and accessing buildings, parks, all the things that I could do he couldn't do. And that's what really got me into planning. And a teacher in my school, Mountlourdes Common Grammar School in Enniskillen, encouraged me to do some work experience in relation to planning, just in the local, it was then Planning Service of Northern Ireland office in Enniskillen. And I enjoyed that. And that, ultimately led me to apply for planning in Queen's. And so I went to Queen's, I did my undergraduate, I did my postgraduate there. I think the great thing about, studying planning in Queen's then was the close relationship between the architecture school and the engineering school and the planning school. And actually we had shared modules, which was great. So I got basic training in design and basic training in engineering. But also I had the opportunity to do the Erasmus scheme. And I went to a planning school in the Netherlands, in a university in Nijmegen, in the east of the Netherlands. And there we had planning students from right across Europe. So, it was really brilliant. I think the way that they teach planning in the Netherlands is very practical, so we were sort of learning in bite-sized chunks, 6-week chunks. And, it wasn't abnormal for a lecturer to say at 9 o'clock in the morning, get your bikes, get on the train. We're going to see a site in Amsterdam. So, so that was great. And it was very practical experience. So that definitely got me even more interested in placemaking and sustainability. So after I did my undergraduate, Erasmus, postgraduate in Queen's, I then went to work in London. So, I was very focused on getting myself on a graduate training program because I wanted to become a chartered planner. And at that stage, in terms of the opportunities that were open in Ireland and the public or private sector, there wasn't that opportunity to, do formal training towards becoming a chartered planner. And that was available in a number of companies in London. And at that stage, one of those companies was GVA. It was called GVA Grimley at the time. It's now called Avison Young. And I was selected as one of their graduates. And I worked in the planning, development and regeneration team. And there we specialised in large urban regeneration projects. And it was quite unique in the private sector at that stage in that it was pretty much the only company in the UK that had this multidisciplinary team of planners, of chartered surveyors, of architects, landscape architects, urban designers that were working collectively on large-scale urban regeneration projects. So I was very lucky to be exposed to amazing projects. Looking back now, I realise how lucky I was to work on things like King's Cross St Pancras and the Olympic bid and Battersea Power Station and Canada Water. And that was just in London because we were also involved in housing renewal projects in Manchester, the Bulls Ring in Birmingham. I was lucky enough to be the PM for a new pilot initiative that the government had set up to tackle their housing crisis. It was called the Brownfield Land Assembly Trust, which was assembling land across the southeast of England to basically develop it for housing and community and recreational infrastructure. So, it was a really great experience. And, being a typical person in my 20s at the time, my cousin and I decided to jack in our jobs a few years in and go traveling, go to Australia, do all of that kind of stuff. And then came back to Ireland. And after working for a large company, I said, I want to work for a small company. So I started working for a company called Colin Buchanan, which was quite well known at the time, sort of a transport planning and planning business. And, we did a lot of work on development planning, so making local plans, county plans, housing strategies, retail strategies right across the Republic of Ireland. But we also did a lot of work in Northern Ireland. And because of my previous experience in the UK, I continued to do urban regeneration type projects there as well. So now, it became 3 companies in one. Colin Buchanan got purchased by SKM. It ultimately got purchased by Jacobs. Something called the Great Financial Crisis happened, and an organization called the National Asset Management Agency was established. And I was asked to be an external board member of the Planning Advisory Committee, which I did for 10 years. So, that was an incredible experience, sort of seeing the consequences of bad planning, bad development. And I think what we seen there, it wasn't necessarily that our planning colleagues had done a bad job. There was huge interference in the planning system. There was deregulation with the rush to get development realized, and the consequences were being picked up for the next sort of decade. So that was an incredible experience, but I was doing that part-time. So the day job was also, I initially set up my own business to run down all the sort of Jacobs contracts in Ireland. I got a contract working in Dáil Éireann for a period of time. So that was part-time, working with 16 members of the opposition, and ultimately got a job in the Department of Environment, Community and Local Government. And that was quite deliberate in terms of going into government. I knew that I wanted to move to Switzerland, and I had no government experience. And I knew that if I wanted to work for one of the international organizations, whilst I had lots of clients who were from government, I hadn't actually worked in government. So I needed to get some government experience. And at night, I was doing an MBA. I did that over 2 years. And then from that, I ultimately applied to work for the World Economic Forum, and I managed to get selected. So I was very lucky. There was many interviews. There was more than 5,000 people going for one job. So I was very lucky to get the job. And I found myself as an entrepreneur in residence, setting up the cities team, ultimately set up real estate, engineering and construction, and now it's 3 separate divisions of the World Economic Forum. So I worked there for nearly 9 years. So it was very much a startup that became a big global entity. And then we had resources right across the world that were working on city initiatives. So we tended to work with mayors, ministers, business leaders, civil society and academia on both global research and localized, very specific projects. So, at the very beginning of what I started doing in the World Economic Forum, I'm suddenly thrown into creating huge plans for rapidly growing cities in 3 separate parts of China, and I'd never been to China before. So that was an incredible experience. And equally did that across India, Africa, Latin America, Europe. So, normally what would happen in that regard was that a country wanted you to come in and work on a specific challenge they had, whether it was housing or critical infrastructure or nature. So I did that for almost 9 years. And then I came back to Ireland. I started working for Arup. Arup, of course, is a multinational design engineering firm. We're known more for the engineers in the firm rather than the urban planners or the architects or the landscape architects, albeit our global CEO is also an urban planner. So probably one of the better known urban planners in the world. And here I've been doing a variety of things because of my previous experience. I still continue to do a lot of global initiatives with the likes of the World Economic Forum, Earthshot, C40, and so on and so forth, in terms of global cities-related research and specific cities-related research, but also obviously project work, looking after the likes of the EBRD. We do projects across 60 countries in which they operate in. So it's been quite a diverse portfolio for the last 3.5 years. And I also I'm a member of the Holcim Foundation. Holcim is one of the largest cement manufacturing companies in the world. And they have a foundation which is focused on creating sustainable cities across the world. and driving, the use of sustainable materials in construction. And I also sit on their foundation board. So I've had a very different experience as a planner to the average planner. And what I would say is it was following life's path. I didn't start with a plan saying I'm going to do all these, different things. Life took me there. And I think, before I moved to Switzerland, I would have thought that there was no opportunities for planners who were qualified in a particular country to work outside their country. But the answer to that is no, there are opportunities. You just have to search for them.
And that's a really great foundation into your career so far. And it brings us into, I suppose, what your day-to-day work is like now with Arup. So what does a typical day or a typical week look like now for you with Arup?
I think no week is the same. If I just think about this week, I'm working on a proposal, first of all, for a pan-European housing project. We have done already the first phase of work. This is the second phase of work, which is really working on the business case to deliver low carbon, affordable housing at an industry level in a pan-European basis, so right across Europe. So there you're looking at understanding the planning environment in right across Europe in all EU countries, and you're seeking to understand the industry standards and norms. You're seeking to define what is causing the challenge as is, and the challenge is very different in every single European country. And then you're seeking to understand what you need to do to unlock that challenge and how industry could drive it. But equally, this week, I'm also working on something we've been doing with the Earthshot Prize. So the Earthshot Prize is a prize set up by Prince William to tackle climate action. And this week I'm finalising a report which we're putting out. Over the last year, I've been chairing the Earthshot Prize Public Sector Working Group, which was actually focusing on unlocking city climate solutions in cities right across the world. And we identified 132 separate solutions that were being used in cities. I should say really urban environments, because some of them are actually quite small towns rather than cities. And we whittled that down to ultimately one that won and two that were runners up, with Bogota winning in terms of what they've done to decarbonize transport in the city, and also what they've done in terms of their development pattern, where they're seeking to preserve as much of the land as possible. So they have a 30-70 model, built development on 30% of the land area, and 70% of the land area is preserved for nature. So this week I'm finalising that report, which is showcasing the 11 solutions that we thought were worthy of consideration for the final prize, with one winning and two being runners up. And what we're trying to do is get the message out there. If you are going to seek to implement a climate innovation initiative in your city, what it takes to be successful. And I suppose the big thing that I'm seeing is leadership. All of the cities that we dealt with, the 130 plus, all said they had no money at the beginning of the project. They had no money to implement, but they managed to find a way. And so I think it really shows that leadership was critical to implement those projects. So there are two of the things. Tomorrow, I'm getting on a plane and going to Milan. I'm meeting with my colleagues from across Europe who work in cities planning and design. And we're going to drill into the critical issues that we see in a city-related environment in Europe and how we plan for the next year. So, we're already seeing a focus on defence. So how do we as planners plan for defence? But equally, we're seeing that married with housing. So we're seeing many countries seeking to retrofit barracks and make them available for, their armies to live in again, because they're investing so much in defence. We're also thinking about AI. We're seeing this huge surge right across Europe in the development of data centres, but data centres use a lot of energy and a lot of water. So we're really thinking about how do we deliver the data centers that's needed for AI? So that will be the next 2 days of my week. So this isn't the average week. Another week I might go to Davos or Mythen or some of those things as well, or be specifically working on a local project in Ireland. So this isn't the average week.
And something that you started introducing there was how there's a shifting, global operating environment for cities. And I like the way that you're talking about urban environments, because I do sometimes wonder if there's a slight anti-urbanism, maybe in an Irish context in particular. And we maybe don't talk about cities the way that we should talk about cities. And obviously we have to bring our large towns and other settlements into that as well. But the context for countries and those cities or urban environments is changing globally and as well as locally. You mentioned climate, you mentioned AI, you mentioned sustainable materials and things like that. But if you had to pick one or two, I suppose, megatrends that you're seeing at a global level that you think are going to impact Ireland and may already have done so, what are you starting to see? Is it defence? Is it data centres? What is coming down the line?
So I think, given we're sitting here on a rainy day, we're starting to see the impacts of climate. And we've certainly seen that over the last couple of months. Climate is a crisis that hasn't gone away. And I think what we have seen, however, is that to drive climate action, we need to demonstrate the business case that results from that action. So, whilst we led previously with a narrative of this will result in emissions reduction of X, the argument that has been made to the European Union by businesses, indeed by politicians in each of the member states, is that has resulted in a situation where Europe is not competitive when it seeks to trade with another bloc, but equally people who are on the lowest incomes can't afford the change. So if we are going to bring about change, we've got to demonstrate that it has a return on investment, that it delivers multiple benefits. So our health, our well-being, resiliency, as well as emissions. So that is definitely a trend that I'm seeing, that the narrative has changed. Climate hasn't gone away. Action on climate hasn't gone away. But we need to demonstrate the business case associated with climate action. And in that regard, I mentioned I look after what we do with the EBRD, but one of the things that we have been doing a lot of, indeed, we're working on a project right now in a city in Morocco, is creating Green City Action Plans. And the Green City Action Plan is where we first understand what is the vision for the future of that city, therefore what are the climate transition projects that the city needs to invest in, and identify that pipeline, and then help them with the investment plan to realize the financing of that infrastructure. Which brings me to my second point. I am seeing that it is no longer okay as planners to say this is our future vision without identifying that pipeline and without identifying how you pay for it. And I think we really, as planners, need to educate ourselves on what does it take to finance infrastructure, but what does it also take to finance real estate? Because they're two different financing propositions, but also what does it take to finance urban regeneration? Because we as planners, to unlock these types of urban regeneration sites and cities, we need to work them, because to sort of decontaminate them, to get them to a point where there's a master plan, to get them to a point where there's a planning permission, we need to do that work. And if we are going to get an investor to come in, finance it, develop it, we need to understand what it takes to finance that real estate and finance that infrastructure that needs to be delivered on site. So I'm definitely seeing, there is a gap, an infrastructure finance gap. And in our profession, historically, we haven't had sufficient understanding of finance. And I'm seeing a lot of cities really lean into that, to understand what it takes to finance infrastructure and what it takes to finance real estate. Real estate tends to be notoriously short term. So, real estate investors will invest in a short-termist manner in accordance with the asset class that they think will generate the greatest return at that point in time. And if we think about in recent years, a lot of that investment has been in two asset classes, life sciences and data centers, because they see a return. But both of those asset classes come with enormous draws on energy and water, particularly data centers. And I mentioned data centers previously, and I suppose, I was in Davos a few weeks ago, and AI was very much top of mind, top of agenda everywhere. And broadly, what I took away from that was 2026 is going to be the make or break year for AI. This is a race. There's two superpowers in the race, the United States and China. China is currently managing to produce AI with less energy and water, but they also have access to more energy given the amount that they've invested in their grid in renewable energy in recent years in comparison to either Europe or indeed the United States. So it's a race between two superpowers. The technology players who are in that race recognize that not everybody is going to emerge unscathed from that race. So, we may have some that fall by the wayside as they try to achieve what they're seeking to achieve in the AI race. But with that AI race comes an enormous demand for data centers. And they are focused on countries and states and places that are climatically conducive to having data centers. And we are one of those countries. We're climatically conducive to housing data centers. So whilst we already would have the biggest proportion of our energy in Europe dedicated to data centers, that is likely to increase because there is going to be further demand for building data centers here. And I think what we as planners have to think about is, how do you do that and ensure that you're not compromising the energy that's needed for other infrastructure? So hospitals, schools, housing. How do you deliver those data centers, provide the energy they need without compromising other asset classes? And one of the things that I took away from Davos was, it was a Chatham House Rules conversation, but broadly they were saying some countries will have to make the decision between providing data centers or housing because there just isn't enough energy. So whilst that was quite a crude way of putting it, I think what we need to think about is, how are we going to provide the energy for these infrastructure asset classes? Data centers, life sciences also demand a lot of energy, but equally, how are we going to provide the water? And I think in that regard, we need to think increasingly around, how can those data center facilities generate their own energy? How can they deliver district heating? Do they actually need to use fresh water? Can we use recycled water? So I think these are the kinds of things that we have to think about in the context of these developments, because they're not going to go away. We are a country that's climatically conducive for data centers, so we need to think through this. Albeit Elon Musk was saying next we'll be building data centers in space. So I'm not sure how planners are going to plan for that, but that was certainly something that he was talking about. And I suppose the other things that I see is the need to focus on placemaking. And I think this is where we need to take a look at our education systems. I mentioned earlier that when I was at Queen's, we focused a lot on design and civil engineering as part of our course. And we need to get back to that. When I meet with planners in the Nordics, they focus most of their time on forward planning, on placemaking, on bringing forward regeneration systems. And particularly with AI, will we need so many people focused on development control in the future? Can AI do a lot of that for us? So I think what we need to get back to is really focusing on placemaking. I'd love to see a scenario where we have a digital twin for the entire country, looking at how our country could look by 2050, but equally in a city-related context. One of the things we're working on in Arup at the moment is a 2050 plan for Madrid. And so whilst we're making the overall plan, we've also been asked to develop a digital twin for the city so that it will help us when we're making the plan to scenario test, but it equally will help the planners in the future. So I think these are the kinds of things that I'm seeing elsewhere that we need to start thinking of increasingly. Final thing is, and this is a new thing that I'm seeing in Europe, Europe has been investing through the decarbonisation of industry funds in funding carbon capture and storage plants. And these plants are for hard to abate sectors, like, for example, particularly cement manufacturers. And we're seeing these enormous applications are going to emerge to capture the carbon associated with the production of the likes of cement manufacturing. And, when I visited a site not so long ago in Greece, in essence, you were looking at a carbon capture and storage plant being developed alongside a cement manufacturing plant together with a desalination plant to take water from the sea to provide the water for this plant, along with an energy plant to provide the energy for the cement manufacturing plant and the carbon capture and storage plant, which was, focused on renewables. So they were leveraging solar power, along with a new port. So once the carbon has been, made into a liquid, they're transporting that carbon to a former oil field. So you're starting to see these huge, complex, projects being developed in the hard-to-abate sector. And whilst I'm not aware of any being planned in Ireland, it's just something to have on our radar, because I'm still not sure how our colleagues in Europe are going to go about permitting these projects. But equally, we're also seeing them in Canada. And in Canada, the Prime Minister has put this type of infrastructure under his major projects office. So he's really focusing on nation building infrastructure that is under his major projects office, and carbon capture and storage is one of those types of projects that he's put under his office.
And I want to bring those back down to that Irish context then. So planners and local authorities and the private sector starting to prepare in plan making, in their projects and development management, defence, AI, a changing climate, and then those technologies like CCS and data centres and things like that. I just want your thoughts on two things closer to home, I guess. And one would be the focus on housing and the recent iterations of the housing plan. And obviously you've got long experience of this through your work in NAMA and still today. And then also that infrastructure action plan. And I guess some of the plans that the government has in the south for those. Do you think they are ambitious enough? Do you think they're too ambitious? Do you have concerns about how they're going to work in practice? I'd be interested in your thoughts, really, I suppose, about the direction of travel in those two things, housing and infrastructure, which would seem to be the two major challenges that the country is facing, but also that is crossing the desk of planners and sometimes unfairly being, I guess, laid at the foot of planners and planning.
First of all, on the infrastructure front, I think what we historically have been good at here in Ireland is creating a plan, but not actually creating bankable projects. So the National Development Plan is a vision, in my mind. And the pipeline of projects that jump out of that with multi-year funding, with a start date and end date, hasn't really been delivered. So that is, you have a vision, you don't have a pipeline of projects, and therefore you don't have infrastructure projects that attract international investors or indeed give the certainty to contractors that you're actually going to deliver. So that has been a perennial problem that we've had. I think there has been very serious moves made by the government, and they have to be absolutely welcomed. I think particularly setting up the infrastructure task force, ensuring that that task force produced an action plan rather than a set of recommendations, that it's time limited, and they are seeking to implement each of those actions by the end of the year. That has to be absolutely complemented. There is something, however, that I think we need to be aware of, and that is that we don't have all the buses coming at once. And what I mean by that is, so if you are delivering a pipeline of infrastructure projects, normally you have to attract a certain set of international contractors to come in and lead those projects with domestic contractors supporting them. So there's only certain contractors in the world that are able to deliver mega infrastructure projects. And they're the likes of Ferrovial and, Acciona and Bouygues and Vinci and Eiffage. And so there's a small selection of companies. And the ones I've just mentioned are the French and Spanish, but there are others, the Italians, Webuild, and so on and so forth. They're sort of the ones that have broadly come in before and delivered, for example, our motorway projects, or delivered our runway at Dublin Airport. So it's these kinds of entities that you're seeking to attract to come in. And broadly, what they want to see is if they come in to deliver the metro, that there's something after it. So what I mean by that is, we are not ambitious enough in the sense that we should know what line 2 is. We should know what line 3 is. So once you bring these guys in, if you're going to ensure that you keep them in the country and the cost of building is going to be less, you've got to show them that there's an X project and an X project. And there is a particular mayor that we deal with in a European city, and she says, never let the tunneling guys stop tunneling. because she's focused on continuing the expansion of the metro because it means that it can be done at a price that makes sense. So we need to think about how we have projects that they can move from one project to the next. If we don't do that, what we risk is if all of the projects, if we're trying to deliver all of them at the one time, then the cost of delivery will increase. Inflation will set in. But equally, the other thing is, how will we resource it? So I think one of the things we have is that the contractors need to have subcontractors in Ireland. And because we haven't had a pipeline of civils infrastructure projects really in the last decade that were significant, we haven't had a significant pipeline. A lot of those contractors have went to building things like data centers and life science plants and are doing a really good job doing that and are actually building a lot of those plants right across Europe. So we need to have the resources to be able to construct those projects. And I think that's where the phasing comes in. But equally, to give certainty to those contractors, you need to have multi-year funding. You need to show commitment across government, right? Infrastructure projects, you deliver them for the long term, 50, 100 years, governments last about 5. So you need political support. Political risk is something that contractors and investors really worry about. So you need to demonstrate that there's cross-party support for your vision, your pipeline, your multi-year funding, and that, when they come into the country, that project isn't going to be stopped halfway through. So, they're able to get a return on their investment. So I think that's something we need to be very aware of from an infrastructure perspective. Turning to housing, we need to think about how we connect housing with infrastructure. So housing is infrastructure. It's an asset class that we often miss when we're talking about infrastructure. And I'm going to give the example of Copenhagen about how they thought about metro, utilities, housing in a collective way for the future of Copenhagen. And in one sense, it has been a victim of its own success, but I'll come back to that in a second. What they had was a situation in the 90s where their city was on its knees financially. And what they did was they basically took the assets, the land and property assets of the city, the land assets primarily, and they pulled them together. So there's about 95% of the assets was Copenhagen's and about 5% of the assets was national government's. And they pulled those assets and they put them into a special purpose vehicle to disconnect it from politics. And that special purpose vehicle, Port and City, as it's known in English, or Byhaven in Danish, and please excuse my Danish pronunciation, but it broadly went about borrowing against the value of those assets to deliver the first phase of the metro. My colleagues have worked on it ever since. They're on line 5 now. But when they put in the metro, by the way, that was the most expensive option. Light rail was the cheap option. The long-term expensive option that enabled them to develop the city was metro. So they put in metro. And alongside those metro lines, they developed their utility infrastructure. They put their utility infrastructure in. But they also built housing around the stations. They either did that with JVs or selling the land or, other mechanisms, but they built housing around the stations. But from profits, they injected their profits into the next phase of the metro. And they injected their profits into the urban regeneration of industrial quarters within Copenhagen. So when I said they became a victim of their success, the problem that Copenhagen now faces is a little bit like Dublin, in that they don't have balanced development across their cities in Denmark. So Copenhagen is the big centre. The population is going to Copenhagen. So it's meant that they still have an affordability problem because so many people want to live there, and which is, the situation we have, that again, Dublin is the centre that attracts most of the population. It's the economic powerhouse of the country. So that is the problem they have. But what they did do was made very good use of their public wealth, their public assets. And I think that's something we really need to look at. Final point then on housing specifically. I think one of the things we have to accept is demand and supply of housing will never fall into equilibrium if you just have the private sector providing housing. The public sector has to provide housing too. And why is that? The private sector will only be able to borrow when there's confidence in lending towards housing. And if we look at the great financial crisis, for example, what you had was lending stopped, and we were many years into recovery before lending started again. So the public sector needs to be always making sure that they're bringing that quantum of supply that's needed into balance. The other thing I would say is housing is something that it tends to be looked at in a piecemeal manner rather than a holistic manner. It needs to be looked at in a holistic manner. You need to understand the demand side and supply side challenges that are giving rise to the problem. We as planners primarily look at the supply side challenges, and we need to break that supply down into the timeline. So if we think about we have a crisis right now, you need to work on the opportunity to unlock assets to meet the crisis, but you equally need to start working on how you deal with medium-term supply and long-term supply all at the same time. And what I mean by that, when you have a crisis, the first housing unit that you might be able to make available to somebody is actually what's built already. And you need to understand what is your vacancy level, both in housing, commercial property, your short-term rentals. You need to understand that. And for example, Melbourne has done that by leveraging water data from smart meters. And Paris has done that by leveraging electricity data. So, understand what is your current baseline and how can you, any of those vacant units, how can you bring them back into use? How can we get people living above the shop? How can we, bring derelict buildings right across our cities and villages into use again? I think a village I know really well in County Leitrim, because of a family connection, is Mohill. And that used to be, when I was a child, an incredibly vibrant village with every business opened, people living in that centre, but now hardly anyone is there. So how do we get people back living in those villages? Can we attract older residents who can't get care in rural areas back into living in some of these, above the shop or ground floor premises that are vacant in our towns and villages? So we need to find a way in the short term of unlocking everything that's vacant, getting the maximum utility out of the asset is what you'd say in an infrastructure sense. But it's the same way that the first thing you do in a water crisis is try to deal with your leaks. We need to deal with our leaks, which is vacancy. The second thing you need to understand is I think it's remarkable when you gather planners together in Ireland to hear the number of units that are already permitted and they're not being developed. So they're shovel ready, to use the jargon, but they're not being developed. Why? You've got to understand that. Is it ground conditions? Is it a developer that's not fit to take that particular development forward? I remember I talked about Battersea Power Station. The first time I worked on that particular project, and I've worked on it 3 times in my career, the first time there was a developer sitting on that asset who just wanted to hold an asset in sterling and had no intention of developing it. So in that kind of scenario, does the state have to intervene with compulsory purchase to try and bring an asset forward for development or a site forward for development where there's a planning permission in place? Is it that there's a viability issue? Is it the cost of infrastructure is such that it's not viable? Is it that it's only viable if they develop a particular type of unit for the developer and there needs to be some kind of subvention to make that asset work? So I think we really need to understand all of those permissions that are not coming forward. Why? The other thing is to work towards permissions for serviced land and zoned land. But urban regeneration is where we need to focus a lot of attention in our towns, villages, and cities. Because and indeed, I think it was Niall Cousin who got some research done on this a number of years ago. And there's also Canadian research that says a very similar thing. But broadly, what it shows is that the cost to the taxpayer of urban regeneration sites versus greenfield sites is less. Why? Because the public infrastructure spend on greenfield sites is more. If you think about it, you have to deliver transport, utilities, you have to expand your schools, GP surgeries, etc. So there's a very significant cost to the taxpayer. And many of these brownfield sites are sitting in inner city areas with schools with, falling numbers, GP surgeries similar. They've got transport already. You can walk and cycle to your place of work. So there's also emissions elements. So it's both good for bottom line in terms of what it costs the taxpayer, but it's also good for climate. But the only way these sites will come forward is if we planners start working them. And I think we've done a piece of work with C40 and Urban Partners in this recently, looking at what it takes to unlock urban regeneration in Europe. But in a pan-European context, there's more than 250 million housing units available through urban regeneration sites if we focused on unlocking them. So I think to solve housing, you need to work on your short, medium and long-term supply altogether. And I wish the Housing Activation Office every success in doing so.
And then finally, I do want to bring it back to people, because I suppose planning is ultimately about the talent and the capability and the capacity of people that are working it. What advice would you give to somebody starting out in their career, an early career planner, somebody who's looking maybe to do a planning course? What do you think, what experiences or learning do you think they need to get? You mentioned that, you've studied management, financial literacy, you've talked about design, placemaking, policy work, getting all that experience. What would you point to, or what do you think a well-rounded planner, I guess, should take, or what opportunities are out there for people who are going to study planning now or maybe are at the early stage of their career?
I've done a lot of work in Japan, and in Japan they talk about basically your 100-year life and your 70-year career and your 7 careers over that 70-year career. So I'm not sure I want a 70-year career, but I think it's a very good way of looking at it, that what we qualify in today is going to change. And we constantly need to be learning and developing. And I suppose I'm a bit of a weird urban planner in that I've studied, an undergrad in planning, a postgrad in planning, an MBA, and a master's in global leadership. And I'm a chartered member of the Royal Town Planning Institute, a member of the Irish Planning Institute, a member of the Academy of Urbanism. So, I'm involved in various initiatives. What I would say to any planner is be curious, but also get a really good baseline education that is in design. If you can bring in the civil engineering element, it's really important. Understand placemaking. I listened to a chief planner in another country recently say planners need to be left brain and right brain people. And what she was getting at there is that we have a vital role in terms of creating the vision for what a place needs to look like in the future and planning for that. But equally, we have a vital role in developing partnerships and, working with local populations to understand what they want and articulating what we see as a possibility to them, but equally working with politicians and working with, multidisciplinary colleagues coming from engineering, architecture, finance, climate, nature, it goes on, archaeology, etc. So we need to be able to broker partnerships and a way forward and convene, as well as be visionary, creating place, and making sure that projects stack up. So what I would say is, please try and get a grounding in design, get a grounding in engineering, get a grounding in placemaking, but equally expose yourself to finance, expose yourself to technology, because, in an AI world, a lot of what planners do today won't be necessary in the future. So I think also be prepared to move sector, move country, and do that even when you're a student. Be prepared to go on an Erasmus program. For me, I think going to the Netherlands was revolutionary. And I would encourage you to take those opportunities where they present themselves. If life takes you to another country, don't think just because I'm a planner qualified in Ireland that I can't do something. Believe it or not, planners have incredible transferable skills. And I only realized that when, it was my husband's work took me to Switzerland. So it wasn't, my decision to have a career in Switzerland, was life took me there. And I discovered that actually there are things that I could do when I moved to another country. But also what I would say is, as a planner, always seek the voices that are not heard in terms of doing consultation. Think about children, elderly people, disabled persons, migrants. Think about how you hear from them as well as hearing from the loudest voice, because your job is to create inclusive places of the future. And it's very important that you get that data from right across society to inform that.
Alice, that was really fascinating, and thanks so much for giving me your time. But before we wrap up, is there anything that you'd like to point listeners to in terms of ideas or projects or reading or best practice or maybe bad practice that you think people should keep abreast of or follow?
On housing, actually, in the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago, we did something called Making Affordable Housing a Reality in Cities. And I would recommend looking at that because it sort of looks at the issue holistically. It looks at how it's being addressed in many places across the world. And, it's still very much read, even though it's a couple of years old, because it really looked at the issue holistically. And I think for those interested in housing, I encourage you to do that. Also, for those interested in urban regeneration, do look at our C40 Urban Partners Arup report on unlocking sustainable urban regeneration in Europe, which really presents what it requires for urban regeneration to stack up. And do check out our Earthshot report, which is coming out in a few days, on how to unlock climate innovation in cities. So they're just a couple of things. Aside from that, I'm reading a really interesting book, which I'm going to recommend, and it's The New Geography of Innovation. And it's totally disconnected from a planner's world. But what I'm trying to understand is what's happening in AI and innovation so I can think about what it means in the built environment context and understand what's happening in Asia, because Asia is so far ahead of the rest of the world. And I'd encourage planners to really understand what's happening in the likes of a Singapore and Copenhagen, understand good practice and understand where innovation is at.
Alice, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you'll get the next episode automatically, and remember to share it with a friend in the sector. Just tell them to search Irish Planning Institute on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by the Irish Planning Institute. From me, Sean O'Leary, thank you for listening.